Welcome. This is the professor lecture number one on ableism and neurodiversity. And we're looking at this in this course as a spectrum of normative to non-normative behavior in terms of oppression and how it shows up. Um, and maybe the mystical and the mundane can be another way to look at that duality of neurodiverse to neurotypical. Essentially, though, ableism is a system of discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities, um, physical or mental disabilities. And the DSM-5 is the determinant in your field for mental disabilities, and there are a variety of categories that we will touch on briefly later in this lecture that fit into disabled in the DSM-5. And you will be using that book manual often in your practice, particularly when you're working for an agency. And it's required when you're working and billing for Medicaid, which I encourage you to work with populations that receive Medicaid. This discrimination, as in prejudice against people with disabilities, physical or mental, is rooted in the assumption that non-disabled bodies and minds are the normative ideal, and that is a societal promotion, not a personal moral choice per se, but it is how society promotes this and why it is discussed in this course, Social and Multicultural Foundations of Counseling. This discrimination can manifest in overt or covert forms, as in public policies, practices, language, and attitudes. And these things marginalize and devalue or exclude individuals with physical, cognitive, sensory, or psychological differences. Ableism is not simply about access to things, it's also about power, perception, and the privileging of certain ways of being human over other ways of being human. And that definition was adapted from the Sue et al. 2019 text that you have for this course. And some of this lecture will touch on a few of the things from that text. Bear with me as I get to the online portion of the lecture. So, as I mentioned, we're looking at this as sort of a spectrum. People who are diagnosed or labeled as disabled experience oppression more so than people who are labeled as normative or able-minded or able-bodied. And that is sort of the spectrum of oppression there. And all along that spectrum, people have varying experiences with oppression and privilege. But let's go back very quickly to um, when this was established in Western cultures, mainly in Western Europe. And they began to look at ability and disability from the perspective of the causality or what caused these differences in the diversity of people. And differences themselves and diversity itself is not a problem. It's when we impute value to those differences and create a hierarchy around those values and therefore privilege or disprivilege people depending on where they lay in that hierarchy. But the causality that people used to believe in Western Europe was that mental disability, quote unquote, was demonic or demon spiritual possession of sorts. Then they changed from there over time into this somatogenic perspective, which is that physical functioning, like bodies and genetics, were the causality of disability, mental disability. Um, then they went to a psychogenic perspective, kind of saying that these people's mental experiences, their brains, were the causality of these disabilities. And now we see disabilities, mental disabilities, hopefully outside of a hierarchy where we treat people as less than. But unfortunately, our society does still maintain that. But as a blending of spiritual, body, mind imbalance that is impacted by society. And that's where we are today as a society. And you might have different feelings about that depending on where you are as an individual. So, discussing a few key points from the text around ability and disability. Sue speaks of disability now as a minority identity, similar to other quote unquote minorities in the United States, like members of the LGBTQIA plus community, indigenous peoples, Latinas, and so forth. Disability or disabled minded people are considered a minority at this point. So it's not merely a clinical condition. Um, these people are often marginalized through ableism. And essentially, this minority model, frames disability as resulting more from societal failure to accommodate differences than individual deficit. It is not the fault of the individual who is diagnosed with a mental disability that they are discriminated against. It is the fault of society viewing them differently and then imputing value to those differences and harming them. Sue text also speaks of the models of disability, the moral, medical, and minority model that shapes how individuals experience disability and how therapists engage with people with disabilities. And understanding this model is important to culturally competent care and not viewing your client as broken or um, your responsibility to fix them as they are broken or there's something wrong with them. They show up in a way that is unique and beautiful, and you are meeting them where they are, regardless of how the DSM-5 or your agency is requiring you to label them with some sort of mental disability, very likely. The Sioux text also speaks of the invisible nature of disabilities and misconceptions around them, particularly physical disabilities, but also mental disabilities, with this idea of masking or hiding our disabilities from each other in a way to avoid discrimination and to fit in with the typical nature of society. Many mental health conditions are not outwardly visible. This can often lead to misunderstandings, misattributions, and increased stigmas, even within this loving or helping profession. Intersectionality also plays a part. Disability identity intersects with race, gender, and class, compounding experiences of oppression. There is more research that is needed in the impact of intersectionality with ableism, and I hope that some of you decide to go on to PhDs in research psychology, or at least support those ethical research endeavors and happening to give us more information on intersectionality. You are called upon in the Sioux text to confront your own biases. Um, Common mistakes that do come up in this helping profession are over focusing on disabilities or literally ignoring it altogether, assuming dependency of your clients because of their labeled disabilities, and minimizing your client's autonomy. Both these omissions and commissions are errors and can be clinically harmful and ought to be avoided. The promotion is strength-based counseling, so focusing on resilience, creativity, spirituality, and self-advocacy as prominent strengths in this population of people with mental disabilities. Your job is to help amplify or help your client amplify these capacities, and therefore empowering your clients to find meaning, redefining their self-image, and ultimately to thrive, regardless of their labeled disability and how society is treating them, while also understanding that there are challenges to overcoming oppression within a society. Family caregivers can play a pivotal role. Um, Therapy with folks with disabilities or along the neurodivergent spectrum should address family stress, guilt that may arise, blame, while also enhancing collaborative coping strategies within the family. So essentially, strengthening problem solving within the family can improve the clients and caregivers' well-being. It can be challenging to be a part of any family system. There are also challenges as the intersection of ableism and family dynamics arises. Sue beckons you to understand that students, workers, people generally with disabilities face disproportionate challenges, and you should be supporting your clients with disability, with mental disabilities or physical, in their advocacy, self-determination, and continual access to academic and employment accommodations. And that ought to be part of your treatment planning. And that's a synopsis, let's say, of the Sioux text and this section on ableism. So now to get at what we're talking about specifically, the various types of disabilities. There's mobility disability, right? So an example of this would be cerebral palsy, which is damage to developing brain, affecting motor control, muscle tone, and coordination. That would be an example of mobility disability. Then we have visual disability, blindness, tunnel vision. These are a few examples. We have auditory disability, which is hearing impairment, permanent hearing impairment, or auditory nerve damage. And again, when we're speaking of physical disabilities and even mental disabilities, these are things that can arise at a point in your life. And you could spend most of your life not experiencing a physical or mental disability, and then something can happen. And like that, you might be in this category or this minority grouping and experiencing disability. For example, you could be have typical vision throughout your life, and something can occur that leads to blindness. And you are now in the experience of visually disabled. Speech disability is another type of disability. Systemic disabilities, such as multiple sclerosis, a chronic autoimmune disease that damages the nervous system and causes fatigue, pain, and motor impairment. So something around the bodily system. There are learning disabilities, right? Like dyslexia is an example of that, difficulty with word recognition, decoding, and spelling. And then there are, of course, psychiatric disabilities, and this is the realm that you mainly work in, such as major depressive disorder, which would be characterized as persistent depressed mood, diminished interest, fatigue, and impairment of daily functioning. There are developmental disabilities, which you also work with often, such as the autism spectrum disorder, as we're now looking at neurodiversity and autism spectrum. And this can be characterized loosely as persistent deficits in social communication, restricted interest, and repetitive behaviors. And then environmental disabilities, such as asthma, which can be triggered by environmental allergens. Here are some um, definitions for you of how the American Psychological Association defines disability. And the perspective that I had a few years back on, therefore, what a disability is, building off of the American Psychological Association. And then I will share my personal perspective on this, I believe, on the next slide. But disability, according to the American Psychological Association, is a lasting physical or mental impairment that significantly interferes with an individual's ability to function in one or more central life activities, such as self-care, communication, social interaction, or employment. Therefore, ability, building off of this definition, is experiencing none, right, as in no lasting physical or mental impairments, or you have a lasting physical or mental impairment that does not significantly interfere with an individual's ability to function in one or more central life activities, such as self-care, communication, social interaction, or employment. Essentially, acknowledging that one's ability to mask and hide a part of themselves or their so-called disability actually can sometimes have them avoid being labeled as disabled. But I think it's good for you to have the APA's definition of disability that governs the DSM-5 manual. Here is a non-APA definition that I came up with that I think is a little more sensitive to the fluidity and the humanity of people that are labeled with mental disabilities or physical disabilities. I define ability as the capacity to, as in, can it be done with accommodations? And by accommodations, I mean without limitations, and with patience, effort, and intention. Therefore, I define inability as the societal responsibility or failure, as in the inability to recognize and acknowledge everyone's capacity to contribute to society in an equitable and meaningful way. I also see inability or a disability as oppressing another person. I see that as a disability. To oppress another is to use one's power or authority in a cruel, unjust, or burdensome way to control, subdue, or subordinate an individual or group. Perpetrating oppression can cause significant psychological damage, leading to moral injury, guilt, distrust, and emotional detachment. And therefore, I see oppressing another as a disability. So the lasting physical or mental impairment in this case would be oppressing another, um, and it significantly interferes with an individual's ability to function, um, as in dehumanization occurs, right? Seeing the oppressed or the person you're oppressing or that someone is oppressing as less than human, um, that allows the oppressor to rationalize their violence, exploitation, or cruelty without guilt. Another inhibition to functioning that occurs when oppressing another, in my opinion, is the need for power and control. There's this deep-seated need to dominate others, and that is often the core motivation in oppressing another. This can be driven by personal insecurities, trauma, or psychological dependence on the power imbalance. Another infringement to functioning or impairment to functioning, in my opinion, from that occurs when oppressing another. False consciousness, this distorted understanding of reality where the oppressor sees their position of dominance as natural, earned, or deserved. And this self-serving delusion is a form of denial that allows them to ignore the injustices that sustain their privilege. Then there's lack of, moral disengagement, right? Oppressors, develop strategies to distance themselves from the harm they cause. They might blame the victim for their own suffering or appeal to a higher morality to justify their actions. Another impairment to functioning that arises when oppressing another is this lack of empathy and the action of manipulation. And this suppression of empathy allows for the cold, calculated, manipulative manipulation of the oppressed. When empathy does surface, it is often suppressed or distorted to maintain control. And empathy can loosely be defined as witnessing the suffering of another and wanting it to end. So lacking that or manipulating that, I think, is one of the consequences of oppressing another. And then finally, projection. People who are oppressing often project their own negative traits, such as laziness or greed, onto the oppressed group. And this creates a psychological justification for this mistreatment. And in this way, I view oppressing another as a disability. There's an intersectionality component, and as I mentioned earlier, there's more research that needs to be done into the intersectionality of people experiencing ableism and who also hold other oppressed identities. In this way, we'll be looking at the intersection of ableism and classism, how classism impacts the determinant of ability or disability in the United States of North America. And mainly that's based around the GDP or contributing to the capitalist economic system in some way. If you are deemed more capable or able to contribute to the GDP, then you are often considered more able-minded and able-bodied. Many of the disabilities in the DSM-5 manual have to do with how one's abilities interfere with their ability ultimately to contribute in schooling or employment engagements. There are also familial and daily tasks and other things, but the DSM-5 seems to be built around forming an opinion of one's ability to be able-minded in conjunction with the perception of their ability to contribute to the monetary system. And in that way, there appears to be an intersectionality between ableism and classism, which is quite harmful and minimizing. If we valued humans beyond what they could contribute to the monetary system or to the gross domestic product, we may have a different way of looking at people with disabilities, and that may minimize the impact of the oppression or alleviate the oppression of people with disabilities altogether. Yeah, just want to articulate that often disabilities are imposed by certain things, and they're actually, and sometimes people are born with disabilities, but often they are imposed, and that this is not necessarily accidental. War and being in a war zone can definitely contribute to PTSD, among other things, and a diagnosis of mental disability regarding that. Violent crime, growing up and experiencing poverty, right? Lacking basic resources such as water, food, clothing, and shelter can contribute to the arising of a disability. Unsafe working conditions, neglect of a person as a child or as an elder can lead to disabilities. Low public safety standards, degradation of the environment by contaminating water, air, and food can lead to disabilities. Lack of medical care, and just how we structure our society and our buildings and our communities can lead to disability. In other ways, lack of representation and experiences of people with disabilities can exacerbate the consequences of oppression and discrimination as it relates to their diagnosis. Pervasive stereotypes of people with disabilities as well can exacerbate stigmatization of physical and mental limitations, the cultural attitude that physical or mental differences that deviate from the normal are less than can exacerbate. Being made invisible, stigmatized, stereotypes of disabilities, they feed into fear, ignorance, and pity in temporarily able-bodied people. Assumptions that disability is a personal or family problem rather than a matter of social responsibility can exonerate us from taking the necessary steps as a society to minimize ableism, and that can exacerbate people's experiences with disability and further cause harm and suffering. So, a few of the counseling impacts of ableism, as in what may arise as you're counseling and what to kind of look out for, because that is the training program that you're in. You want to be careful to avoid pathologizing the person that you're working with that has been labeled with a disability instead of their environment. You may unknowingly or accidentally adopt this medical model, as in focusing excessively on fixing your client instead of addressing societal barriers, and you thus may be reinforcing ableist assumptions. This can result in your client feeling alienated and maybe even internalizing their disability as part of their identity. You want to be mindful to not hold a common blind spot, as in failing to explore the disability identity. You don't want to treat the disability as irrelevant or secondary. You don't want to avoid discussing the disability because in this way are allowing space for your client to discuss their disability in empowered ways. Because if you do, you may be invalidating the client's lived experience. And in this way, you may miss an opportunity for self-affirmation and growth in your client. You want to avoid assumptions of dependency and incompetence in your client, right? Ableism often shows up in the clinician relationship when you or the clinician assumes that the client with disabilities are helpless or emotionally fragile. This is stripping the client of autonomy and it undermines the strength-based approach that we're supporting. And it subtly repositions you as the rescuer, which is an unhelpful dynamic in the clinical relationship. You want to be very mindful that you are creating accessible spaces, physically, psychologically, and procedurally, right? So you want to have accessible office spaces, readable paperwork. You want to avoid rigid communication styles that can create barriers that signal exclusion. Ableist norms within the counseling setting itself can erode trust and limit therapeutic engagement before it even begins. Remember, you are engaging in a relationship that's founded on trust and comfort to support your client as a polished mirror in doing the work that they have established they would like to do. And if that work, this is as an aside, but if that work is masking better, then that's what you will support them in. If that work is liberation work and promoting their autonomy to be who they are, even in an atypical, so-called atypical way, and even if challenges may arise from that, then you are to support them with that. And then finally, you're going to want to try to avoid overlooking the intersectionality of things, right? When you're treating a disability in isolation without considering gender, class, race, or culture, your therapeutic lens is then narrow. And you can be reinforcing a monocultural standard of mental health and perpetuate this invisibility for clients whose identities are complex. And in this way, you might be multiplying their marginalization. So now we'll move on briefly to discussion of neurodiversity, but you have a lot of resources in the your modules online around neurodiversity, and a large extended discussion in class around that as well. But just to give a brief background, the term neurodiversity emerged in the late 1990s, and it was coined by a sociologist, Judy Singer, to describe the natural variation in human brains and nervous systems. So just natural, as part of the beauty of diversity of people. What is unnatural is imputing value to this diversity and then creating a hierarchy around that value, and oppressing people. Originally, this was framework within the autism community, and it challenged the dominant medical model at the time, um, around the treatment conditions for disabilities such as autism, ADHD, and dyslexia, where they were seen as solely as deficits or disorders. Instead, neurodiversity emphasizes that neurological differences are part of normal human diversity and can offer unique strengths alongside challenges. This perspective has since influenced psychology, education, and your world of therapy, and it's encouraging practitioners now to adopt a strength-based, inclusive approach that respects individual cognitive profiles rather than seeking to solely normalize your clients. So essentially, neurodiversity now in 2025 refers to recognizing and respecting the natural variation in human neurocognitive functioning, including differences such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and other neurological profiles. In contemporary scholarship and practice, neurodiversity now emphasizes strength-based inclusive frameworks, and it values these diverse ways of thinking, learning, and experiencing the world. Again, similar to its foundation, but moving beyond deficit focused models towards equity and empowerment. And this movement has reshaped mental health counseling, by challenging this deficit-based model, and I encourage you to continue, to do that, to view neurological differences not as pathologies to be fixed, but as variations requiring specific and tailored therapeutic approaches, cultural humility, and advocacy for accessibility. You will be part of shifting, and expanding ethical practice, fostering greater inclusivity, and emphasizing this collaboration with clients to affirm their identities, support them affirming their identities, reducing the stigma of neurodiversity, and supporting their flourishing. And here is a little slide that, gives sort of a visual to what is being discussed here around neurodiversity. And please feel free to pause, and take a look at this, if that is helpful. So, some brief final thoughts before we close out this, online lecture. I do believe that if people are harming another person, that they need and deserve therapy. The therapy ought not come from the person that they are harming or the people they are harming. It is not the responsibility of the victim to heal the oppressor. And oppressors are often victims themselves. And it's not their responsibility to heal their oppressor. But I do believe there's an obligation or a right for people who harm to receive therapy. And then just acknowledging that even within this spectrum approach of neurotypical and neuroatypical that expresses the spectrum of neurodiversity, it's still within a duality of norm and abnormal. And there may be ways in the future that we move more towards a cyclical way of looking at these things, as in like a circle or a crypto or non-spectrumed perspective. I'm not sure today completely what that would look like, um, but I have faith that that will be occurring in the future. And I would really like you to think about your perspective on changing or conforming um, your individual client versus or in addition to changing and conforming societal standards and norms. So thinking of the question of like, do you believe that changing um, someone who is labeled as neuroatypical or mentally disabled to fit into societal norms, or is it more society's responsibility to shift what is normal to accommodate for the natural diversity of people? And what does that look like in a capitalist structure? And what does that mean for your career and how you feel about yourself in this loving or helping profession? And a final thought, countering ableism is not simply a matter of accommodating our natural differences. It is also to radically welcome them into the discourse, in my opinion. Um, your responsibility, from my perspective, is not to normalize your client, but to humanize, to work with them on humanization, not to correct your client, but to connect with them and to support their connection with the world. When you and I work hard to dismantle these ableist frames, we're not just serving disabled clients better, we are becoming better healers ourselves. I have faith in you. I look forward to witnessing your infiltration of the traditional mental health field. And I believe that the future is bright.